Tonight we're slipping in through a side door of a great stone palace, somewhere in Europe, somewhere around 400 years ago, into the warm and slightly smoky world of the people whose entire job was to stand beside the most powerful person in the country and tell them, gently, that they had spinach on their crown. We're going to spend the next couple of hours among the fools, the favourites, the licensed truth-tellers and the small employed legends of the royal court, the strangest staff a household ever kept on its books, paid in coins and cast off velvet to be exactly themselves in a building where everyone else was pretending to be someone better. It's a peculiar profession to fall asleep to, but there's something soothing about a job whose chief requirement was that you not take any of it too seriously. A man whose whole purpose, in a room stiff with ceremony and quiet menace, was to be the one person allowed to yawn at it. If you find you enjoy these long, slow wanders through history's odder corners, a like helps the channel more than you'd think, and subscribing means another one of these turns up the next time you can't sleep, but only if it's your sort of thing. And while you're lying there, tell me in the comments where you are and what the local time is. Because there is something I find genuinely lovely about a few thousand people all drifting off in different time zones to the same quiet story. Now the ritual. Dim the lights or switch them off. Put a fan on for white noise if that's what you like. Get comfortable. Set the phone aside or turn it face down and slide the screen brightness all the way to the bottom and plug it into a charger. Did you know that some court fools were paid more than knights? That a king of England once kept a man whose recorded job title was more or less the king's fool, and that we still have the household accounts listing what they spent on his clothes? Did you know there were two completely different kinds of fool, and that mixing them up would have offended both? Did you know one famous court favourite was, by the best surviving accounts, presented to a queen by being lifted out of a giant pie at dinner, and that he later became a captain, fought duels, and was captured by pirates? Did you know a fool once talked a furious king out of a terrible decision by pretending the king had already made the wiser one? That some of them grew rich, owned land, and left wills? That a few of them are the only reason we know certain royal secrets at all, because they were the only ones in the room nobody bothered to keep secrets from? You've just woken up in a long stone gallery, cold underfoot, the kind of cold that lives in old buildings no matter the season, and somewhere ahead of you there's firelight and laughter, and the laughter is the only honest sound in the whole palace. Let's go find out who's making it. Start with the thing everyone gets wrong, because untangling it tells you almost everything about how this strange little economy worked. There were two kinds of fool at court, and the distinction mattered enormously to the people involved, even if it's mostly been flattened in the centuries since. The first kind was the natural fool. The second was the artificial fool, sometimes called the licensed fool, or simply the jester. They wore overlapping costumes and shared a workplace, and were often listed side by side in the same account books, and they were not remotely the same job. A natural fool was a person who, in the blunt language of the time, was thought to be simple, someone with what we'd now recognise carefully as a developmental or intellectual disability, or sometimes a physical difference that set them apart. The court took them in, fed them, clothed them, and in the better cases genuinely protected them, and in the worst cases displayed them like a curiosity in a cabinet. It's an uncomfortable thing to sit with, and we'll sit with it honestly tonight rather than pretend it away, because these were real people and they deserved to be more than a footnote. The kinder court seemed to have grown real affection for their naturals. The household would fuss over their clothes, fret when they were ill, and mourn them sincerely when their lives ended. The crueler ones treated them as living entertainment and little else. History, frustratingly, usually only lets us see them through the eyes of the people who employed them, which is a bit like trying to understand someone's whole personality from their performance review. The artificial fool was a different animal entirely. A professional. This was a clever, quick, often highly literate person who had chosen the work and was extremely good at it. The artificial fool's genius was social. He could read a room of dangerous people the way a sailor reads weather. His real product was not the joke, it was the truth, delivered inside the joke so that it couldn't get him in trouble. He was, functionally, the only member of staff with permission to disagree with the monarch out loud, and that permission was the single most valuable thing he owned. Think of it as a kind of diplomatic immunity, except instead of a passport it was a bell-trimmed hat, and instead of representing a foreign country, he represented the unwelcome idea that the king might occasionally be wrong about something. A counsellor who told the king he was making a mistake might find his career, and on a bad day his neck, suddenly much shorter. The fool could say the very same thing, dressed up as nonsense, and the king would laugh, and the dangerous thought would slip into the royal head wearing a clown's costume, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, it would do its quiet work in there. That was the trick. That was the whole profession, really. Everyone else at court had to flatter. The fool was paid to be the one voice that didn't, and the paradox is that this made him, in his way, the most honest person in the building and the most theatrical, both at once. The costume helped. You know the look even if you've never thought about where it comes from. The party-coloured coat split down the middle into two clashing halves, the hood with donkey ears or a rooster's comb, the little bells, the carved stick called a marotte topped with a tiny fool's head that the jester could use as a puppet, a second self to blame the rudest remarks on. I didn't say the treaty was a disaster, sire, he did. And he'd waggle the stick, and the king would laugh, and the marotte would get away with it because the marotte was made of wood, and wood has no neck to lose. We'll meet the marotte again. Keep an ear out for it. Let's put a name and a face to it, because the records actually let us, which is rarer than you'd hope. In the court of Henry VIII of England, a man whose moods could redecorate the map of a continent, there was a fool named Will Somer. He arrived at court around 1525 and stayed for decades, outlasting the king himself and serving on, remarkably, into the reigns that followed. In a household where the people closest to the throne had an alarming tendency to lose their positions, and occasionally a good deal more, Will Somer simply kept his place, year after year, like a comfortable chair nobody wanted to move. We know more about him than about almost any other fool of the period, because he turns up in the actual paperwork. The dry, wonderful household accounts where someone with a quill recorded every shilling spent on keeping the court running. There are entries for Will Somer's clothes, his shoes, the keep of his small retinue. He appears in a famous family portrait of the king, tucked into the edge of the scene, present at the very centre of power, and yet standing slightly outside it, which is exactly where a good fool wanted to be. What made Somer extraordinary was his read on the one man no one could read. Henry was, to put it with great delicacy, not a relaxing person to be around. His displeasure had consequences that rippled outward for years. And into that atmosphere walked a fool who could, by the surviving accounts, make the king genuinely laugh. Not the thin, courtly laugh of people performing enjoyment for their own safety, but the real thing, the kind that loosens a clenched jaw. There's a reason the king kept him close. When you are the most feared person in your kingdom, surrounded by faces arranged into careful, pleasant masks, the one person who treats you like an ordinary, slightly ridiculous human being becomes oddly precious. Summer was, in a strange sense, the king's relief from being king. He used it to the stories, and we have to hold the stories a little loosely, because fools collected legends the way a wool coat collects burrs, have him slipping real criticism past the royal guard. Comments on the court spending. Sly observations about people who'd grown too powerful. The kind of remark that would have ended anyone else's afternoon, landed softly as a joke and absorbed as a joke, with just enough truth folded inside to leave a mark. When Will Somer's own life finally came to its end, well after the king's had, he was buried with a record of it kept, his name preserved, his place in the household remembered. He'd done the impossible thing, he'd worked for one of history's most dangerous employers, told him uncomfortable truths to his face for the better part of a lifetime, and died an old man in his bed. Not a bad innings for a man whose job was to be laughed at. Hold on to Somer. The pattern he set, the fool as the king's one safe human connection, is going to repeat in court after court, in language after language, all the way through tonight. Here's the question that the whole profession balanced on, the way a spinning plate balances on a stick. How much could a fool actually get away with? The answer was never written down, because the moment you write down the rule, it isn't the rule anymore. The fool's license was unofficial, invisible, and entirely dependent on a feel for the exact width of the line he was standing on. Cross it by an inch and the joke became an insult, the laugh would curdle, and the protection would evaporate in the time it took the king to stop smiling. Stay too far back from it, and you are useless. Just a man in a silly hat saying safe things, which any courtier could do for free. So the art was the line itself. The greatest fools lived right on top of it, toes curled over the edge, and the whole court watched to see whether tonight's joke would tip into the abyss. That tension was the entertainment. Everyone in the room understood the stakes, including the fool, especially the fool, and that shared understanding was the engine of the comedy. There was a real and recurring move in the fool's repertoire that's worth pausing on, because it's genuinely clever. Faced with a king about to do something disastrous, the skilled fool wouldn't argue against it. Arguing was the counsellor's doomed strategy. Instead, he'd reframe the situation so the wiser choice looked like the one the king had already decided on, handing the monarch an exit that felt like his own idea. Kings, like most of us, found it far easier to be talked toward a decision than out of one, and a fool who understood that could steer the ship of state by pretending he was only commenting on the weather. But the license had limits that no cleverness could push past, and they tell you what every court was really afraid of. A fool could mock a courtier, a policy, the king's own vanity, the food, the weather, the war. What he could not safely touch in most courts were the 2 live wires, the legitimacy of the king's claim to rule, and matters of religion when religion had become a matter of survival. Joke about those and you weren't being a fool anymore, you were being a danger, and dangers don't keep their jobs. We have at least one well-known instance of a fool finding the bottom of his licence the hard way, a remark cutting too close to a royal marriage that had divided the whole kingdom, after which the fool found his welcome suddenly and sharply withdrawn. The licence was real, but it was a loan, not a gift, and it could be called in at any moment by the only person who'd extended it. Which is the quietly poignant thing under all the bells. The fool was the freest person at court and the least free, both at once. He could say anything, as long as he never forgot for 1 second that his freedom existed entirely at the pleasure of the man he was teasing. That's a strange tightrope to walk every single day for a living. No wonder the good ones were paid so well. Let's stay with that idea, the line and the price of forgetting where it was, because there's a fool whose whole career is a lesson in it. Archibald Armstrong, known to everyone as Archie, was a Scottish fool who came south to England in the train of a king and rose to a position of real, tangible influence. This is the part that gets overlooked about the successful court fools. They weren't poor figures of pity. Archie did well. He accumulated money, property, and the kind of access that powerful people will pay handsomely to be near. He was sent along on grand diplomatic journeys. He received gifts from people hoping he'd whisper kindly about them into the royal ear. For a stretch of years, Archie the Fool was a man worth flattering, a courtier in everything but title, with a licence to mock thrown in as a bonus. And that slowly was his undoing, because Archie made the oldest mistake in the trade. He started to believe the licence was his by right rather than on loan. The bells went to his head. He developed a particular and very public feud with one of the most powerful churchmen in the kingdom, a man with enormous influence and a notably short fuse where his own dignity was concerned. Archie needled him for years, sensing, correctly for a while, that his fool's immunity made him untouchable. It did not make him untouchable forever. When the political winds shifted and the churchman's fortunes briefly soared, Archie chose that exact moment to make a cutting public joke at the man's expense, a sharp little jab about the churchman's troubles that landed in front of witnesses. The churchman, who had been waiting a very long time for precisely this opening, went straight to the king. And the king, who valued his fool but valued political peace rather more, did the thing every fool dreads. He revoked the licence. Archie was stripped of his position, his fool's coat formally taken from him, and turned out of the court he'd spent his life inside. The official record of his dismissal survives, and it's a remarkable little document. A man being fired, in stately bureaucratic language, from the job of being funny. He retired, by most accounts, a wealthy man, his money safely made, and lived out his days in the country. So he landed softly enough. But he'd learned the lesson every fool was hired never to forget. The licence was never his. It was the king's, lent out one day at a time, and the moment Archie mistook the loan for a possession, the loan came due. Somewhere in all of this, you can almost hear the little wooden marotte clattering to the floor, set down for the last time. Archie talked plenty in his retirement. He even had jokes published under his name. but he never again talked from inside a king's protection. There's a difference between a man saying funny things and a fool saying them. And the difference, it turns out, is the hat. We've been promising you the pie, and a promise is a promise, so let's go to the pie. In the year 1626, at a grand dinner thrown by a duke for a young queen of England, the servants carried out an enormous cold pie and set it before the guests with the ceremony such a thing deserved. The queen was Henrietta Maria French, newly arrived, young, and quite far from home. The crust was broken open, and out of it, rather than the usual theatrical surprise of songbirds or a clever subtlety, stepped a perfectly proportioned boy, not much more than 1.5 feet tall, dressed in a tiny suit of armour, who bowed to the queen as though emerging from baked pastry with the most natural entrance in the world. His name was Geoffrey Hudson. He was about 7 or 8 years old, and he had just become, in the space of one dinner, the most famous small person in England. The pie was a gift, more or less. The Duke presented the boy to the Queen as a living curiosity, and the Queen, delighted, kept him. This is the uncomfortable hinge the whole story turns on, and we shouldn't slide past it. A child was given as an entertainment, the way you might give someone a remarkable bird. That was the logic of the age, and it's a cold logic. But what makes Geoffrey Hudson's life worth a place in our long, quiet wander tonight is that he did not stay a curiosity. He refused across an extraordinary lifetime to be only the boy from the pie. The Queen grew genuinely fond of him, and he of her, and he became a fixture of her household. Well dressed, well fed, given his own small retinue, painted by serious artists, present at the glittering centre of the court. He had a sharp temper and a sharper sense of his own dignity, and he did not enjoy being treated as a toy by people who assumed his size made him one. The court called him, half affectionately, Lord Minimus, the smallest lord, and the nickname captures the strange double life he led, a person of real standing who everyone insisted on measuring in inches. When the kingdom slid into civil war, Hudson didn't sit it out as a household ornament. He was given a military rank, a captaincy, and took it seriously, riding out as part of the Queen's protection when she was forced to flee the country. He ended up in France with her court in exile, a tiny captain in a foreign land, still defending the dignity he'd been fighting for since he was a boy in a pie. And then his life took the turn that lifts it out of curiosity entirely and into something like myth. We'll get to it. To the duel, and the pirates, and the long strange afterward, in a moment, because Geoffrey Hudson's story is too good to rush, and we have all night. But hold the image of that dinner in your mind as you drift. A small boy in tin armour, climbing out of a pie into a room full of the most powerful people in England, looking around at all of them, and deciding, somewhere behind those young eyes, that he was not going to be the joke. He was going to be the captain. The pie was the beginning. It was never going to be the whole story. Here's where it gets unlikely. And the lovely thing is that the unlikely parts are the ones the records actually support. While in exile in France with the Queen's court, Geoffrey Hudson, now a grown man, a captain, and thoroughly tired of being treated as comic relief, was mocked one time too many by a court gentleman named Crofts. The teasing was the usual sort, aimed at his size, the kind he'd endured his entire life. This time, Hudson didn't laugh it off. He challenged the man to a duel. Crofts, treating the whole thing as a continuation of the joke, is said to have turned up to the appointed meeting armed with a water squirt, the 17th century equivalent of showing up to settle your differences with a soaking. He thought it was a comedy. Hudson, on horseback to even the difference in their heights, did not. The duel went forward in deadly earnest, and when it was over, Crofts was the one who hadn't survived the encounter. The man who'd treated Hudson's dignity as a punchline learned fatally and far too late that the small captain had never once been joking about it. Duelling was a serious offence, and the consequences forced Hudson out of the exiled court he'd called home. And from there his life became a sequence of misfortunes that would have flattened a larger man. On a sea voyage, his ship was set upon by raiders from the Barbary coast, and Hudson was seized and carried off into captivity in North Africa. He spent years there, by his own later account, a very long stretch of them, held far from everything he'd ever known. The boy from the pie now a captive on a distant shore, about as far from a queen's dinner table as a life can travel. He was eventually freed or ransomed and made his way back to England, an older man now, his famous patron's world long since swept away by the wars. And here the records offer one more curious detail that reads almost like the universe relenting. At some point in his middle years, after a lifetime at one remarkable height, Hudson is said to have grown, adding a substantial measure to his stature later in life, an unusual late change that the people of the time noted with wonder and that modern observers have tried to explain in various ways. The boy who'd been famous for being small spent his final decades being simply a small man rather than a tiny one, which after everything feels like a quiet kind of mercy. His last years were hard and obscure. He had outlived his fame, his queen's court, his own legend. The world that had lifted him out of a pie and made him a captain had dissolved, and he ended his life in difficult circumstances, far from velvet and candlelight. But consider the span of it. A child presented as a novelty grew into a man who fought a duel for his honour, survived years of captivity across the sea, served a queen through a civil war, and refused every single day of a brutally long life to be the small joke the world kept trying to make of him. The pie got him in the door. Everything after the pie he did himself. That's a life. Sleep on that one a while. Cross the water now to the Spanish court, where something genuinely different was happening. Not in how the curiosities were employed, which was much the same cool logic everywhere, but in how one painter chose to see them. The court of the Spanish kings kept a substantial number of these figures, fools, naturals, and small or unusually formed people, all grouped under a Spanish word that translates with that same flattening coldness to something like buffoons. They were a fixture of palace life, attached to the royal children, kept around the great echoing halls of the Alcazar. And among the painters of that court was a man named Diego Velázquez, who was, by common agreement, one of the finest who ever lived. What Velázquez did with these people is one of the quietly radical acts in the history of painting, and it's worth lying still for. He painted them. That part wasn't unusual. Court curiosities got painted all the time, as accessories in grand portraits, props beside a prince, a small figure tucked in to flatter the height of the royal child beside them. What was unusual, what was almost unheard of, was how he painted them. He gave them the canvas to themselves. He sat them down and rendered their faces with the exact same searching, dignified, unflinching attention he gave to kings and popes. Look at his portrait of the man called Sebastián de Morra, and you won't find a joke. You'll find a person, seated facing you directly, holding your gaze with an expression that is intelligent, weary, and entirely unwilling to perform for you. Velázquez painted him the way you'd paint a philosopher. There's no costume gag, no comic framing, none of the cruelty the subject surely endured daily from the courtiers around him. Just a man, looked at honestly, granted the full weight of a human interior at a time when almost no one else in his world would have granted him any at all. He did it again and again. The figure called El Primo, shown seated with an enormous book, a great ledger nearly as big as he was, gazing off in thought like a scholar interrupted. The one called Francisco Lescano, painted with aching tenderness. Across this series, Velázquez did something his whole age mostly failed to do. He treated the court's curiosities as subjects rather than objects, sitters rather than props, people rather than punchlines. We don't know what these men thought of him, or of sitting for him. The records are silent on their side, as they almost always are. But the paintings survive, and the paintings are an argument, a 4 centuries-old insistence, in oil, that these were people, that they had inner lives, that the cruelty of their situation was real, and so was their humanity. Velázquez couldn't free them. The system was the system, and he was a man inside it. But he could look at them, properly, the way no one else bothered to. And he could make the rest of us look too, for as long as the paint lasts. Which is, when you think about it, the same gift the best fools gave their kings. The truth slipped in past the defences, dressed up so it could get through. Velázquez just used a brush instead of a bell. Move forward a century into the powdered and perfumed world of the 18th century, and the role of the court curiosity took on a new and rather chilly flavour, the flavour of the cabinet. The collection, the Enlightenment habit of acquiring remarkable specimens of the natural world and arranging them on a shelf. At the court of Lorraine, presided over by a deposed king of Poland named Stanisław, who'd been handed the little duchy as a consolation prize, there lived a celebrated small person known to all of Europe as Bibi. His real name was Nicholas Ferry, and he was famous across the continent, genuinely, internationally famous, a person people travelled to see and wrote letters about. He was tiny, charming as a small child, and the court doted on him, dressed him exquisitely, and showed him off to every distinguished visitor who passed through. Bibi's story sits at an uncomfortable junction, and it's worth being honest about why. He arrived at court as essentially a living marvel, a person treated, with real affection but also real coldness, as a specimen of the curious and the rare. The same Enlightenment minds that were measuring everything, cataloguing the world, building the great encyclopedias, looked at Bib and saw a fascinating instance of nature's variety. He was beloved and he was studied, sometimes by the same people in the same breath, and the line between being cherished and being collected was, for him, almost impossible to find. There's a famous and rather sad rivalry that grew up around him later in his life, when another small person arrived in Europe, A man named Joseph Borolaski, who was everything Bebb wasn't. Educated, witty, socially graceful, fluent in the arts of the salon. A person who could hold a sparkling conversation and play the guitar and charm a room on his own terms. Borolaski represented a different and far better fate. The curiosity who became a gentleman, who controlled his own story, who turned his fame into a long and dignified independent life and eventually wrote his own memoirs, telling the world about himself in his own words rather than letting the world decide what he was. The contrast between the two men is the whole arc of this profession compressed into a single comparison. Bebby was loved, but never quite allowed to be a person, he remained, to the end. The courts adored Marvel, cared for but never fully his own. Borolaski took the same starting point, small stature, European fame, dependence on noble patrons, and steered it, through sheer wit and will, into self-possession. He outlived nearly everyone, dying at a very great age in England, respected, remembered by his own account rather than someone else's. He got the thing Beebe never quite reached, authorship of his own life. And that's the quiet theme tightening underneath all of this, the one I'd like you to drift off holding. Every one of these people was handed a role: fool, marvel, specimen, ornament, by someone more powerful than themselves. The whole shape of their lives came down to a single question: how much of themselves could they keep? Will Somer kept his footing for a lifetime. Geoffrey Hudson kept his honour at terrible cost. Velázquez's sitters kept at least their dignity on canvas. Borolaski kept everything: his story, his voice, his own ending. The system tried to make them into things. The remarkable ones, against very long odds, stayed people. Rest there a while. We've more courts to visit, more bells to follow, but the question travels with us into every one of them. In a world that wanted to put you on a shelf, how much of you did you manage to keep? Let's get out of the throne room for a section and into the counting house, because nothing tells you what a society actually valued like the place where it wrote down what it paid for things. The account books, the dry, beautiful ledgers where some long-forgotten clerk recorded every coin that left the royal purse, are where the fool stops being a legend and becomes a line item, and the line items are wonderful. A fool cost money, and not a trivial amount. The records show payments for the fool's wages, yes, but also for the upkeep around him, his clothing, often surprisingly fine, his shoes replaced regularly, because a fool was on his feet performing, the keep of whatever small staff was assigned to him, his food and lodging, and touchingly often his care when he was ill. A natural fool especially might have a keeper, a person paid specifically to look after him, to dress him, to make sure he ate and was warm and didn't wander somewhere dangerous. That keeper had a salary too, and it's all there in the books, the entire cost of one human being's existence rendered in the patient column arithmetic of a royal household. The clothing entries are the ones that catch the eye. Fools were dressed, and dressed well, because a shabby fool reflected poorly on a rich master. So you find expenditures on good cloth, on the party-coloured coats, on the coxcomb hoods, on green and yellow and motley fabric, sometimes on quite expensive materials that an ordinary servant would never have been given. There are entries for the bells. There are entries for repairing or replacing a fool's stick. A Occasionally there's a payment for something charming and specific. A special coat made for a particular festival. A new outfit for a royal wedding where the fool would be on display alongside the finery. What this tells you is that the fool was an investment, a deliberate expense, a thing the household chose to spend real money maintaining year after year. He wasn't a stray who'd wandered in and been tolerated. He was staff with a budget line, as official in his way as the cooks and the grooms and the men who looked after the king's horses. In some courts the fool's annual cost ran comparable to that of skilled, respected servants, and in the case of the star performers, considerably higher. A truly beloved fool could end up among the better compensated members of a household, out-earning men who'd have considered themselves vastly his social superior, which must have caused no end of quiet resentment in the servants' quarters. And here and there the ledgers crack open into something almost intimate. A payment made because the fool had been sick and the king wanted him tended properly. A reward handed out because he'd particularly pleased the company one evening. The keep of a fool's horse, or his dog. Money spent burying him decently when his life ended, with a record kept of the cost, which is its own small dignity, that someone, somewhere, thought the passing of the household fool worth a careful entry in the accounts. You can read the whole shape of a relationship in those numbers if you sit with them. Not love exactly. The power was always too lopsided for that. But something. Investment. Habit. The strange tenderness people develop for a person who has made them laugh across many long years. The bells cost money. Somebody paid for them, on purpose, again and again. That's not nothing. In a world that wrote down only what it cared about, the fool got written down a great deal. There's a French fool whose legend has grown so large and so tangled that pulling the real man out of the stories is like trying to find one particular thread in an old tapestry, but the legend itself is worth the visit, because of what it preserves about the line and the cost of crossing it. Triboulet served at the French court in the time of King Francis I, and possibly a king or two before, and his name became attached over the centuries to so many jests and anecdotes that he eventually floated free of history altogether and became a kind of all-purpose fool figure, the jester other writers reached for when they needed one. A famous play used him, a famous opera grew out of that play. He became, in a sense, the Platonic court fool, the one everybody half remembers without knowing his name. The flesh and blood man underneath all that is genuinely hard to make out. But one story clings to him so persistently that it's worth telling, because true or not. It crystallizes the exact danger at the heart of the trade. In the tale, Triboulet makes a joke at the king's expense, a joke crossing one of the live wires, something cutting too close to the king's own person, or honour in a way that even a fool's licence couldn't cover. The king, furious, condemns him, and tells him he may at least choose the manner of his own departure from this life. And Triboulet, quick to the last, replies that he would like to pass away from old age. The king, caught between his anger and his delight at the sheer nerve of the answer, laughs and relents, and merely banishes him instead. Whether any of that happens scarcely matters now. The story has done its work for 500 years. It captures the fool's predicament in a single exchange. The man whose only weapon is his wit, cornered by a power that could end him on a whim, buying his life back with one more perfect joke. It's the trade distilled. Every fool we've met tonight was, on his worst days, one bad joke away from exactly that scene. The laugh that didn't come, the king who didn't relent. Triboulet, in the legend, talks his way out. The real fools didn't always. What the Triboulet stories also preserve is the way these figures outlived themselves, drifting from history into legend into art. Long after the actual man was gone, his name kept working, kept being useful, kept making audiences feel that mix of laughter and dread that the real fools traded in. There's something fitting about it. The fool's whole job was to be remembered as funny by people who'd half forgotten he was a person. He'd have understood, I think, the strange afterlife of becoming a story other people told. He'd probably have had a joke about it. He always did. Travel east now, into the vast cold of Russia, where the role of the court fool took a turn that's harder to find the comedy in, and where the line between jest and cruelty all but vanished into the snow. The Russian court in the time of the Empress Anna kept fools and jesters in abundance, but Anna's relationship with them carried an edge that the cosier Western courts mostly lacked. She liked to humble the proud. Several of her appointed fools were not professional jesters at all, but noblemen, princes, men of ancient family, whom she had reduced to the role of court buffoon as a deliberate humiliation, making them cluck like hens, squabble for her amusement, and perform indignities far beneath their birth. The fool's coat, which a Will Somer wore as a license, and a Geoffrey Hudson wore as a starting point, Anna handed out as a punishment. To be made her fool was to be brought low on purpose, in front of everyone, for the crime of having displeased her, or simply for sport. And then there was the Ice Palace. In one of the most extraordinary and chilling episodes in the whole history of court entertainment, the Empress decided to marry off one of these noble-born fools to one of her serving women, and to make the occasion a grand spectacle, and so she ordered the construction, on the frozen river, of an entire palace built of ice. Not a small folly, a genuine building, complete with ice furniture, ice decorations even, by the astonished accounts. An ice cannon that could be fired, the whole thing carved and assembled from the river itself in the depth of a brutal winter, and gleaming like a jewel in the cold. The fool and his bride were married in elaborate ceremony, paraded through the streets in a procession that gathered up an absurd and pointed variety of peoples from across the enormous empire, each in their own dress. And then the newlyweds were brought to the ice palace and shut inside it for the night, in a bed of ice, in a cold that could end a life. That they survived the night at all is reported with something like wonder. The whole grotesque pageant was meant as a marvel and an entertainment, and the court applauded it as such, and underneath the spectacle was a real man, a nobleman made a fool, and a real woman, both used as the centrepiece of a frozen joke that nobody asked them whether they found funny. It's a hard story, and I won't dress it up as a lark, because it wasn't one. But it belongs in our long night's wander, because it shows the dark far end of everything we've been circling. The fool's role could be a refuge, a livelihood, even a kind of strange power. Will Somer found shelter in it, Archie found wealth, Hudson found a starting line to run from. But it could also be a cage, handed to you as a punishment by someone who held every card, and there was nothing in the bells that could protect you from a master who decided your humiliation was the entertainment. The same coat meant freedom in one court and bondage in another. It all came down, as it always did, to the person holding the other end of the leash. The ice palace melted in the spring, as ice palaces do, and ran back into the river it had been carved from, leaving no trace at all, which is perhaps the only mercy in the whole affair. The cruelty was real, but at least the monument to it didn't last. Let's end this stretch on a gentler and stranger note, with a fool from Poland who is remembered for something almost no other jester is remembered for: his sorrow. Stachik served at the Polish royal court in the 16th century, and like the best of his profession he was famous in his own time for his wit, his sharp political insight, and his willingness to tell uncomfortable truths to powerful people, the usual fool's gifts. But the reason Stachik endured, the reason he became a national figure centuries after his life ended, has nothing to do with a joke. It has to do with a painting, and a moment of stillness, and the idea that the wisest person in the room might also be the most quietly heartbroken. Long after his death, a great Polish painter imagined Stachik at a court ball. At the moment news arrived that the kingdom had suffered a grievous loss, an important city fallen to an enemy. And the painter's idea was this: behind Stachik, through an open door, the ball continues, the court dances and laughs and celebrates, bright and oblivious. And in the foreground sits the fool, alone, slumped in his motley, his jester's cap still on his head, and his marotte set down beside him, his face fallen into deep and genuine grief. The one man in the building dressed to be foolish is the only one who understands what has happened. Everyone wise enough to know better is too busy dancing. That image rewrote how a whole nation remembered him, and it captures something the cheerful version of the fool never could. The license to tell the truth came with a curse attached. You saw things. You saw past the flattery and the ceremony and the comfortable lies that let everyone else sleep at night, because seeing past them was your job. And what you saw was not always funny. Sometimes the fool understood the danger the kingdom was in more clearly than the king did, precisely because the fool was the one person trained to look at things as they were, rather than as everyone wished them to be, and he had to keep the bells on while he did it. There's a loneliness in that which sits right at the centre of this whole profession, and it's a fitting thing to carry into sleep. The fool was surrounded by people every hour of the day, and was, in the deepest sense, alone, the only one permitted to see clearly, and obligated to dress that clear sight up as nonsense so it could be borne. He made everyone laugh, and was, often enough, the saddest man in the palace. Will Sommer, easing a tyrant's clenched jaw. Stachik, grieving alone while the court danced behind him. The same coat, the same bells, the same strange solitary clarity underneath. The marotte is set down again, beside the grieving fool this time, its little wooden face still smiling, because wood doesn't know how to do anything else. Its master, for once, has stopped pretending. Sleep gently. The dancing goes on in the next room, but we'll sit here a while, with the fool who saw too much, and let the candles burn low. We've followed the motley from court to court, but we've never stopped to look at it properly, and the costume deserves its own quiet hour, because almost everything you picture when you hear the word jester is a kind of historical fossil, a set of choices made by real people for real reasons, frozen into a silhouette so familiar we forget it ever had to be invented. Start with the colours. The party-coloured coat, split vertically into two clashing halves, sometimes quartered into four, was not random gaudiness. Divided clothing in the medieval world carried meaning. It marked a person as set apart, as belonging to a different order of things than the people around them in their sober single-coloured cloth. The fool's body was a boundary made visible. Looking at him, you knew instantly that the ordinary rules bent around this person, that he was inside the court and outside it at once, and the coat announced that double status before he opened his mouth. Green and yellow turn up again and again in the records, a combination that seems to have carried a whiff of folly all on its own. Then the hood, which is where it gets specifically strange. The fool's hood was often shaped to suggest the head and ears of a donkey, an animal that stood, in the medieval mind, for stubborn foolishness, or topped with the red comb of a rooster, a strutting, crowing, self-important bird. The coxcomb, that's the word, and it survives in our language still as a name for a vain and foolish person. A little linguistic fossil of the fool's hat embedded in everyday speech. When you call someone a coxcomb, you are, without knowing it, putting a rooster's comb on their head and a fool's hood over their ears. The bells we've mentioned, sewn to the points of the hood, to the elbows, to the toes of the long curling shoes, so that the fool announced himself with sound as well as colour, jingling into a room before he'd said a word. A serious person moved silently and with dignity. The fool moved like a small percussion section, and the noise was the point. It was the opposite of dignity, worn on purpose, a one-man argument against taking anything too gravely. And then the marotte, our little wooden companion, the stick topped with a carved fool's head that we've watched get set down beside grieving men all night. The marotte was a genuinely clever piece of equipment, not just decoration. It was a puppet, a second mouth, a deniable accomplice. The fool could hold it up, give it a squeaky little voice, and let it say the things too sharp to say in his own. It could mock the marotte, argue with it, blame it. A skilled performer turned that stick into a whole second character, a partner in a double act where one of the partners was made of wood and therefore beyond punishment. The marotte was, in a sense, the license made physical, the part of the fool that could say anything because it wasn't technically alive to be held responsible. All of it together, the divided coat, the donkey-eared hood, the rooster comb, the bells, the long shoes, the little wooden head on a stick, added up to a kind of uniform, as recognizable in its day as any soldier's. It said, "This person is exempt. The rules are suspended around him. Laugh at him, and let him laugh at you, and don't reach for your sword when he does, because the bells are a flag of truce. He's the fool. He doesn't count," which was of course the very thing that let him count for so much. Something interesting happened to the fool in England right around the turn of the 17th century. He climbed down from the dais beside the throne and walked out onto a public stage, and in doing so he changed the whole art of the theatre. The court fool and the stage clown were cousins, and for a generation they were nearly the same animal, and following that thread tells you how the profession spread its seed beyond the palace walls. Richard Tarleton was the most beloved comic performer of his age in England, a clown of the public playhouses whose face, with its flat nose and squint, was so famous it ended up painted on tavern signs across the country. He had the true fool's gift for improvisation, for the live and dangerous art of riffing off a heckling crowd, of building a whole bit out of whatever the rowdy groundlings threw at him in the moment. Audiences came as much to see what Tarleton would do unscripted as to see the play itself. He was said to be able to make people laugh just by poking his head out from behind the curtain, before he'd done anything at all, the comic equivalent of a master musician getting applause for a single held note. When his life ended, the grief was national, and his name became, for years afterward, a kind of shorthand for laughter itself. After Tarleton came Will Kemp, a clown of enormous fame, who performed in the same company as a certain playwright you may have heard of, and who specialised in broad physical comedy, in jigs and dances and the kind of crowd-pleasing knockabout that brought the house down. Kemp was so confident in his own celebrity that he once actually danced, a Morris dance the entire long way from London to Norwich over many days as a publicity stunt, and wrote a little book about it afterward. He was a star, and he knew it, and eventually he and the company parted ways. Possibly because the playwright was developing a taste for a subtler kind of fool than Kemp wanted to play. Because the man who replaced Kemp in that company was Robert Armin, and Armin was something new. Where Kemp was a clown of the body, Armin was a fool of the mind, quick, verbal, melancholy, capable of the bittersweet wit that could turn on a sixpence from a joke to something that ached. And it's no coincidence that the playwright, with Armin now in the company, began writing fools of extraordinary depth. The sweet, sad, singing fool in one play, the bitter wise fool in another, the gentle melancholy fool in a third. These weren't simple comic relief. They were the production's truth-tellers, the characters who saw most clearly and spoke most freely, the ones who could say the unsayable to a raging king, which is to say, the playwright took the real court fool, the licensed truth-teller we've spent all night with, and put him on the stage, and made him immortal. Armin even wrote about the profession himself, collecting up stories of the famous natural fools of the great houses, the real ones, the named ones, preserving them with a fellow feeling that suggests he understood exactly what they were and what they were worth. The stage fool and the court fool reached out and touched hands right there, at the close of the 16th century, and the licensed wisdom of the one poured straight into the art of the other, where it has been making audiences laugh and ache ever since. Every wise fool in every play you've ever seen is, somewhere in his ancestry, a real man in a motley coat, standing beside a real throne, risking his welcome to tell a real king the truth. The bells found their way into literature, and there they couldn't be revoked. No king could fire a fool made of words on a page. It was, in its way, the most secure position the profession ever achieved. We've spent the night with the clever ones, the artificial fools, the wits and survivors and self-made captains, because they're the ones who left the brightest trail in the records. But we owe a long, honest, gentle section to the others, the natural fools. The people taken into courts not for their wit but because they were different, and who have the thinnest voices of anyone in this whole story, because almost nothing comes down to us in their own words. They deserve more than to be a footnote, so let's give them the quiet centre of an hour. A natural fool, in the language of the time, was a person of simple mind, what we would today understand with far more care and far more knowledge, as someone with an intellectual or developmental disability, and sometimes a person with a physical difference that the age lumped under the same heading. These people occupied a genuinely peculiar position. The medieval and early modern world had a strand of belief that held such people to be touched by something beyond the ordinary, closer to a kind of innocence, perhaps closer to the divine, speaking truths they didn't fully grasp the weight of. It was a framework that could shade into real protectiveness, even reverence, on its better days. On its worst days it was simple exploitation dressed up as charity, a person kept for amusement and called a blessing to make the keeping feel kind. The honest truth is that the experience must have varied enormously, person to person, court to court, and we can only guess at most of it. In the kinder households, a natural fool was genuinely cared for, given a keeper who looked after him with what reads, through the dry account book entries, like real attention, clothed warmly, fed well, protected from a harsh world that would have offered him very little safety outside those walls. For a person who in the ordinary run of things might have faced terrible vulnerability, the court could be, against all our modern instincts, a genuine refuge. A place where you were valued, where your needs were met, where you had a recognized place in the great household, and people who knew your name and noticed when you were unwell. There are records that read unmistakably as affection. The king who fretted over his fool's health, the household that mourned a natural's passing, the careful provision made for someone's comfort and care across many years. And in the unkinder households, of course, it was exactly what our instincts fear, a person treated as a living curiosity, displayed, prompted to behave amusingly, denied any dignity, their difference made into the entertainment. Both things were true, in different places of different people, and the same role that sheltered one person exploited another, and we will never have the full ledger of which was which, because the people best placed to tell us left almost no record of their own. That silence is the hardest part, and the part most worth sitting with tonight. We have the names of some of them, preserved in account books, in a painter's title, in a stray line of a household record, but we almost never have their interior, their own sense of their own lives, what they thought of the velvet and the laughter and the great cold halls. Velázquez gave a few of them back their dignity in oil. Robert Armin gathered up some of their stories with evident tenderness, but for the vast majority, what we have is a name and a place and a number in a ledger, and the rest is gone, the way the inner lives of nearly everyone who ever lived are gone, only more completely, because so few people thought their inner lives worth recording in the first place. So here in the dark, in the quietest part of the night, let's do the small thing we can do, which is simply to remember that they were people, whole people, with preferences and fears and small daily joys, with feelings about the cold and the food and the company, with inner weather as real and complicated as yours, lying there in your warm bed 4 centuries later. The records made them into a role. They were never only a role. Nobody ever is. Rest gently on that. We'll move on in a moment to brighter and odder corners, but this one we'll leave with care. The way you'd leave a room where someone was sleeping. Return to Spain for a fuller look, because the Spanish royal court assembled, over generations, what may have been the largest and most documented company of these figures anywhere in Europe, and the sheer scale of it tells you something about how completely the role had woven itself into the fabric of palace life. The great rambling royal residence in Madrid kept a remarkable population of fools, naturals, small people, and what the cool inventory language of the court called men of pleasure, a standing company of human curiosities attached to the royal family, and especially to the royal children, who grew up surrounded by them as ordinary fixtures of the nursery and the household. A young prince or princess of Spain spent their childhood among these companions, and the relationships, by all available evidence, could be close and genuinely warm. The small companion of a royal child was a playmate, a constant presence, a familiar face in a childhood otherwise hemmed in by suffocating ceremony, and the bond formed in those years could last a lifetime. These were people with names and roles and recorded lives, even if the records come filtered through that flattening official language. There was the one set to attend the little prince, painted with his great oversized book. There was the man Velázquez rendered with such unflinching dignity. There were entertainers, and there were companions, and there were people whose function blurred the line between the two, kept partly for amusement, partly for company, partly out of a habit so old nobody thought to question it. They were dressed by the court, housed by the court, fed by the court, painted by the court's greatest artist, and embedded so thoroughly in royal daily life that to picture the Spanish court without them is to picture it wrongly. What strikes you, looking at the whole assembled company across the generations, is how normal it all was to the people living it. We recoil, and rightly, at the idea of keeping human beings as curiosities, but to the court itself this was simply the way a great household worked, as unremarkable as keeping cooks or grooms or musicians. The fools and companions were part of the establishment, with their place in the hierarchy, their budget lines, their daily routines, their relationships with the royal family that ranged from cold display to real and lasting affection. A whole population of the overlooked, living out their lives in the corners of one of the most powerful courts on earth, mostly unrecorded except where a great painter happened to point his attention, or a clerk happened to note an expense. And that's the thing that lingers, drifting toward the bottom of this section. How much of all human history is exactly this: vast numbers of people living real and full lives in the margins of someone else's grand story, leaving almost no trace. Remembered, if at all, by an accident, a surviving portrait, a stray account book entry, a name in a list. The Spanish Courts Company of the Overlooked is just an unusually well-documented instance of the most common fate there is, which is to live, and feel, and matter enormously to yourself and to the few around you, and then to slip almost entirely out of the record, leaving the faintest of marks for someone 400 years later to wander over in the dark. Velázquez pointed his attention at a few of them, and because he did, they're still here, still looking back at us out of the canvas with their full and undeniable humanity. The rest we have to take on faith, the faith that they were every bit as real and every bit as whole, even though no one painted them, even though no one wrote them down. They were. Of course they were. Everyone always is. Sleep well. The palace is quiet now. The great hall's dim, The company of the overlooked gone to their rest along with everyone else, equal at last in the dark, the way we all eventually are. Step right out of Europe now, because the impulse to keep such figures beside a throne was not a European invention, it appears, startlingly, across the world, in courts that had never heard of a party-coloured coat, which tells you the role answered some deep and widely shared need in the nature of power itself. When Spanish soldiers reached the great island city of the Aztec Empire in the early 16th century, and were brought into the presence of the ruler Moctezuma, they recorded, amid all their astonishment at the scale and order of a city grander than most they'd left behind in Europe, the presence of entertainers and curiosities attached to the royal household. By their accounts, the emperor kept among his people performers, jesters, and individuals of unusual appearance, small people and others set apart by their difference, maintained in the palace much as their European counterparts maintained fools, present for amusement and for the prestige their keeping conferred. The chroniclers, who came from courts that did exactly the same thing, noted it as something familiar even amid all that was strange to them. What's quietly remarkable is the parallel itself. Here were two civilizations that had developed in complete isolation from one another, separated by an entire ocean and the whole of recorded history, neither aware the other existed until that very decade, and both had arrived, independently, at the idea that a great ruler's household should include people kept for entertainment and for their difference. The same role, invented twice, on two sides of the world, by people who could not possibly have copied it from one another. That convergence says something profound about power and about us. Whenever and wherever human beings have concentrated authority in a single figure, it seems, that figure has wanted around them both the laughter of the entertainer and the strange prestige of the rare and the unusual, kept close like jewels. The accounts also describe the staggering scale of Moctezuma's household more broadly, the aviaries full of brilliant birds, the gardens, the keepers, the vast apparatus of attendants maintaining a court of breathtaking sophistication. The entertainers and curiosities were one thread in an enormous tapestry of palace life, just as the fool was one thread among the cooks and grooms and musicians of a European household. Different world, different gods, different everything, and yet there, beside the throne, the familiar figures, the ones kept to amuse, and the ones kept because they were unlike anyone else. We should hold the same care here that we've held all night. These were people too, with even less of their own voice surviving than their European counterparts, glimpsed only through the eyes of astonished foreign soldiers who understood almost nothing of what they were seeing. What those individuals thought of their lives, of the city, of the strange pale strangers suddenly filling their emperor's halls, we cannot know. The city itself would not survive the decade. But for one brief moment, in the accounts of men who had no idea they were witnessing the last days of a world, we catch a glimpse of them, the fools and curiosities of a court on the far side of the earth, doing the same ancient job their European cousins did, and just as fully, unrecoverably human. Cross to another great empire, the Ottoman court at its height, where a related but distinct tradition flourished, and where the figures kept close to the throne served purposes that ran from pure entertainment into something far more serious and strange. The Ottoman palace, that vast and secretive world, kept entertainers in abundance, jesters, comics, dwarfs and performers of every kind, who amused the Sultan and his court with the same wit and absurdity their European counterparts traded in. The role of the comic who could speak frankly to power existed here too. There are celebrated figures in the Ottoman and broader Turkish tradition of the wise fool, the holy simpleton whose nonsense carried sense, the trickster whose foolishness was a disguise for sharp truth. The idea that wisdom might arrive wearing the mask of folly was as alive in this court as in any. But the Ottoman palace also kept a category of attendant that has no real European parallel, and it's one of the most extraordinary details in the whole subject. The Sultan was served in his most private spaces by a corps of mutes, men who could not speak and who communicated entirely through an elaborate, sophisticated sign language developed within the palace walls. They were kept close to the Sultan precisely because of this. In a court where secrets were everything, and a careless word could topple ministers, attendants who literally could not repeat what they overheard were enormously valuable. The mutes saw the most private business of the empire and could carry none of it out in spoken words. The sign language they used became so refined and so prestigious that by some accounts courtiers and even sultans learned it themselves, the better to communicate in silence, in a place where silence was safety. Some of these figures sat at a fascinating crossroads between entertainer and trusted intimate. A person kept for their difference might also become a confidant precisely because their position set them apart from the ordinary scheming of the court, outside the factions, dependent entirely on the Sultan's favour, and therefore, in a strange way, trustworthy. The same logic that made a European king prize a fool as his one honest companion operated here, intensified by the deadly secrecy of palace politics. To be different, to be set apart, to be outside the normal order, could make a person uniquely safe to keep close, uniquely unlikely to betray you, because they had no faction to betray you to. It's a haunting inversion of everything you'd expect. The qualities that pushed these people to the margins of ordinary society, their inability to speak, their difference, their apartness, were the very qualities that drew them into the most intimate centre of imperial power, into rooms where the highest ministers of the empire were not permitted to go. They kept the Sultan's secrets by their nature. They were trusted because they could not or would not betray. There's a strange dignity in it, and a strange loneliness too, of a kind we've met before tonight, the person valued precisely for being set apart, drawn close exactly because they stood outside, intimate with power, and yet permanently, structurally alone. The mute silent language is mostly lost to us now, faded with the world that used it. But picture it for a moment as you drift, a private room in a vast palace, the most powerful man in a great empire and his silent attendants conversing entirely with their hands, the secrets of states passing back and forth in gestures that made no sound at all and left no trace. A whole language born of the need for silence, spoken in the heart of the loudest power on earth. Down the Rhine now, to a castle on a hill above the town of Heidelberg, where the most famous court fool in all of German memory spent his life guarding the largest barrel of wine you have ever imagined, and where his legend is so entangled with that barrel that to this day you cannot visit the one without meeting the other. His name was Clemens Pankert, an Italian by birth, brought north in the early 18th century to serve the elector who ruled from Heidelberg Castle. He was small in stature, sharp of tongue, and possessed of a quality that made him instantly beloved in a wine-growing court, an apparently bottomless capacity for drink. The story goes that when he was first asked whether he could manage another cup, he answered, in his Italian, "Perch no, why not?" and said it so often, to every cup ever offered him, that the words themselves became his name. Percio, the fool who never said no to wine. The castle was home to a genuine marvel, a vast wine barrel of almost comic enormity, the Heidelberg tun. A cask so large that a dance floor was built on top of it, so large that it could hold a quantity of wine measured not in bottles, but in tens of thousands of gallons, a barrel you climbed stairs to stand upon. The electors' learns paid a portion of their taxes in wine, and it all flowed, eventually, into this colossal vessel. And the man appointed to watch over it, to guard this lake of wine and to be its presiding spirit, was Percio. He became the keeper of the great barrel, its mascot, its guardian, the little man set beside the giant cask, and the pairing was so perfect that it fixed itself permanently in the imagination of the whole region. The legends that grew around him are wonderful, and almost certainly exaggerated, as fool legends always are. He was said to drink a staggering quantity of wine every single day, year after year, and to remain cheerful and quick-witted throughout, a feat that turned him into a kind of folk hero of good cheer. There's a famous and probably invented story about the manner of his passing. That Percio, who had drunk wine and only wine for his entire long life, was advised by a doctor in his old age to try drinking water instead, for his health, and that he did, just once, and that the water was what finally did him in. Whether there's a grain of truth in it, or whether it's the perfect punchline his admirers wished onto him, it captures the man exactly, the fool who lived on wine and was undone by water, a joke he'd surely have appreciated, since it kept him funny even at the end. What lingers about Percio, beyond the comedy, is how completely a single fool could fuse himself with a place. He became Heidelberg's spirit, its emblem, its presiding genius of good humour and good wine. A carved wooden figure of him still stands by the great barrel in the castle to this day, watching over it as he did in life, and visitors still toast him, and his name is still spoken with the warmth reserved for someone who made the world a more cheerful place simply by being in it. Most fools faded into legend and lost their individual faces. Percio did the opposite. He became more himself with the centuries, more vivid, more local, more beloved. A real man transformed into the very soul of a castle on a hill. He guarded a barrel and made a court laugh, and 300 years later the wine is long gone and the electors are dust, and the great cask stands empty, and Percio is still there beside it, carved and grinning, keeping his post. Not a bad afterlife for a man whose whole philosophy fit into 2 words. Why not? East again, all the way to the Mughal court of India at its dazzling height, where the tradition of the clever companion who could match wits with an emperor produced a figure so beloved that his stories are still told to children today, 4 centuries on, across an entire subcontinent. His name comes down to us as Birbal, and he served the great Emperor Akbar in the 16th century, though the man tangled in legend and the historical figure are, as ever, hard to fully separate. The real person was a poet and a wit of Hindu birth who rose to become one of the most trusted intimates and advisers in a Muslim emperor's inner circle, itself a remarkable thing. A measure of both the emperor's famous openness and the sheer force of the man's cleverness. He was not a fool in motley. The Mughal court had no party-coloured coats, but he occupied the fool's essential position with perfect precision. The quick-witted companion at the ruler's side, the one who could be teased and could tease back, the man whose sharpness was prized and whose company the emperor genuinely loved, the licensed wit in a court where a careless word to the wrong person carried the usual deadly weight. The legends that grew around him are a treasure of their own, hundreds of little tales in which the emperor poses an impossible question, or sets a fiendish riddle, or tries to trip his clever companion up in front of the whole court, and in which the witty adviser, every single time, finds an answer so unexpectedly perfect that the trap snaps shut on the one who set it. The emperor asks him to bring something that will make a happy man sad and a sad man happy. And back comes the answer, a phrase about how all things must pass, which steadies the grieving and humbles the proud in equal measure. The emperor draws a line and demands it be made shorter without being touched, and the clever companion simply draws a longer line beside it, leaving the first one shorter by comparison without ever having laid a finger on it. The tales go on and on, each one a small jewel of the same shape, the powerful man trying to outwit his clever servant, and the clever servant turning the cleverness gently back, never humiliating his master, always leaving the emperor delighted to have been bested. That last point is the whole art, and it's the very thing we watched the European fools practice with their kings. The genius was never just in being clever. It was in being clever in a way that flattered rather than threatened, that let the powerful man enjoy losing, that made the emperor feel wiser for keeping such a sharp companion close rather than diminished by him. The wit who simply out-argued his master made an enemy. The wit who out-argued his master and somehow made him laugh and feel clever for having provoked it, that man kept his place, and his head, and the emperor's deep affection besides. It's the identical balance Will Sommer struck with Henry, half a world away, in a court that had never heard of Akbar, and never would. The same impossible job, solved the same impossible way, by people who could not have copied one another. The real man's life did not have a soft ending. He went out on a military campaign and did not return from it, a loss the emperor is said to have grieved more deeply than almost any other in his long reign. A king mourning his wit, the oldest and most genuine of all the feelings in this story. But the legend swallowed the loss and went on without it, and the witty companion became immortal in a way the real man could never have foreseen, his name a household word, his cleverness a delight passed down through generation after generation, told and retold until he belonged to everyone. And there he sits, beside Akbar's throne in the imagination of an entire culture, the clever man who could answer any question, the companion an emperor loved. Proof once more that wherever power has gathered itself into a single dazzling figure, somebody quick and warm and brave has been needed close beside it, to puncture it, to delight it, to tell it the truth, and to love it well enough that the truth could be born. Different coat, or no coat at all. Same beating heart. Come back to England now, and back to a name we've already grown fond of, because there's a peculiar thing that happened to the most famous fools after their lives ended, and it tells you how the figure of the fool slid slowly out of fact and into something between memory and myth. Will Summer, you'll remember, served Henry VIII and survived him, and was beloved enough to be painted into a royal family portrait and recorded carefully in the accounts. But Somer's story didn't end with his life. In the decades and centuries that followed, he became a kind of legend, a figure pamphleteers and playwrights reached for whenever they wanted a fool, much as Triboulet became in France. Jest books appeared bearing his name, collections of witticisms and anecdotes attributed to him, many of them surely invented or borrowed, all of them trading on the warmth of his remembered reputation. He drifted over time from a real man who'd eased a tyrant's temper into a sort of national mascot of clever harmlessness, the platonic English fool, summoned up whenever the idea of a good-hearted jester was needed. This happened to several of the great ones, and it's worth understanding why, because it reveals what the fool meant to the people who remembered him. A society doesn't turn its cooks and grooms into legends. It turned its fools into legends because the fool stood for something people wanted to keep. The idea that truth could be spoken to power and survive, that laughter could disarm cruelty, that the lowest figure in the room might be the wisest, that there was room in the grim machinery of authority for warmth and nonsense and a man who refused to be afraid. The fool, remembered, became a kind of consolation, proof that even in the coldest courts there had been one person allowed to be human, and that people had loved him for it. So the fools became furniture, in a sense fixtures of the cultural imagination, props that later ages arranged and rearranged to suit their own needs. The melancholy wise fool of the playhouse, the cheerful truth-telling jester of the storybook, the sad clown who weeps behind his paint. All of these descend, by tangled roots, from the real men we've spent these hours with, the Summers and the Armstrongs and the Statchicks and the nameless naturals, flattened and polished and idealized by centuries of retelling, until the real people underneath are nearly impossible to make out beneath the legend. And there's something both lovely and a little melancholy in that, which is a fitting note for this late hour. The fools spent their lives being looked at, being laughed at, being remembered as funny by people who'd half forgotten they were people at all. And in their afterlives that's exactly what happened to them. On a grand scale, they became symbols, archetypes, ideas, beloved precisely for what they represented, rather than for who they'd actually been. The very thing that made them immortal also dissolved them. We remember the fool, capital F, vividly. The individual men are mostly gone, glimpsed only where an account book or a painting or a single surviving anecdote happens to pin one of them, briefly, back to the earth. Will Somer would have understood, I think, and probably had a joke ready. A man who spent his life turning himself into entertainment for others would not have been entirely surprised to find that the centuries did the same. He'd set down the marotte, give that little wooden head a last waggle, and let the legend take it from there. Let's do something gentle and slow as the night deepens. Let's simply gather up a handful of the smaller stories, the ones that don't fill a whole section on their own, but that I'd be sorry to leave out. The odd bright fragments that survive from this strange profession, and lay them out one by one like stones on a windowsill. There's the matter of the fool's animals, which turn up more than you'd expect in the records. Fools kept pets, and the household paid for their keep. A fool's dog, a fool's horse, sometimes more exotic companions. A small person at court might be given a pony or a large dog, scaled to make a charming pair, and the bond between a fool and his animal was sometimes the most genuine relationship he had. The one creature at court that wanted nothing from him, and offered no flattery, and didn't care in the slightest about his place in the hierarchy. Somewhere in every great household, you suspect, there was a fool and his dog, keeping each other company in the cold halls, two outsiders who'd found each other. There's the recurring detail of fools being used as a kind of living gift, passed between courts as a diplomatic gesture, a way for one ruler to compliment another. A particularly prized fool might be sent from one monarch to another the way you'd send a fine horse or a rare jewel, which is a deeply uncomfortable thing when you remember we're talking about people, and which also meant that some fools travelled astonishingly widely, seeing courts and countries that almost no one of their station would ever have glimpsed. An accident of their strange status carried them across borders and into palaces, well dressed and well fed, the most cosmopolitan of servants, even as it reduced them to objects to be given away. There's the curious fact that fools sometimes married and had families, and that the household accounts occasionally record provision being made for a fool's wife or children. Small evidence of ordinary domestic lives carrying on underneath the bells, of a man who jingled into the throne room by day, going home to a family by night, being simply a husband and a father once the coat came off. We know almost nothing of these home lives, but the stray records of them are precious, because they remind us that the fool was a whole person with a whole life, and that the part we remember, the performing public part, was only ever a fraction of it. There's the detail of the fool's role at festivals and special occasions, when he came into his fullest glory, the great feasts, the royal weddings, the holiday revels when the ordinary order of things was turned upside down, and the fool was, briefly, nearer the centre of everything. There were seasons, particularly around midwinter, when a sort of temporary fool was appointed even in ordinary households, a lord of misrule, a master of the revels, a person given license for a few wild days to invert the normal rules before the world turned right side up again. The fool, in those seasons, was everyone, for a little while, and there's the simplest fragment of all, which is just the recurring evidence of affection, the king who wept for his fool, the household that mourned, the careful burial recorded in the accounts, the portrait commissioned and kept, the pension granted in old age, the small kindnesses that surface here and there in the dry records like warmth coming up through floorboards. For all the cruelty in this story, and there was real cruelty, there was also this: people loved their fools. Imperfectly, unequally, across a gulf of power that could never be crossed. But really. And the fools, you have to hope, sometimes felt it. These are the stones on the windowsill, small, smooth, easy to overlook, each one a person, or a piece of a person, kept by accident from the great forgetting. We'll set them down gently and let them be. Let's go a little abstract for a slow stretch. because we've gathered enough real fools by now to ask the larger question hovering over all of them. Why does this figure refuse to die? Why has nearly every culture, in nearly every age, found a place for the licensed truth-teller in motley? And why, when the real ones faded from real courts, did we keep him alive in stories, in cards, in plays, in the shapes our imaginations reach for even now? Part of the answer is the one we keep circling back to. Power is lonely and power is dangerous, and any system that puts a single person above all others creates a vacuum where honesty used to be. Surround a person with consequences, make every word spoken to them a calculated risk, and you starve them of the one thing every human being needs, which is somebody who'll tell them the truth and treat them like an ordinary, fallible, slightly absurd person. The fool filled that vacuum. He was the pressure valve, the reality check, the single human voice in a chorus of careful performances. Wherever power concentrated, the vacuum opened, and something fool-shaped tended to fill it. That's not a coincidence of European history. That's a fact about what power does to people, and it's why we found the same figure beside an Aztec throne and an Ottoman sultan. But there's a deeper part, and it has to do with the strange permission the fool represented. The permission to be wrong, to be foolish, to be human, in a world that increasingly demanded everyone be polished and serious and correct. The fool was living proof that folly had a place, that not everything had to be dignified, that the lowest and silliest member of the room might also be the wisest. He was a standing argument against the tyranny of seriousness. And every age that has felt itself growing too rigid, too self-important, too in love with its own gravity, has reached back for him, because he reminds us of something we keep forgetting, that wisdom and foolishness are not opposites, that the person willing to look ridiculous is often the only one brave enough to tell the truth, and that there is a kind of freedom available only to those who've stopped being afraid of looking like a fool. He shows up in the tarot deck, the fool, numbered 0 or unnumbered, standing at the very beginning, stepping cheerfully off a cliff with a little dog at his heels and a bundle on a stick, which is more or less a marotte if you squint. He's the figure of pure beginning, of openness, of the leap taken before you know where you'll land. That image didn't come from nowhere. It comes from the real fools, the men with the bells and the sticks, distilled over centuries into a symbol of the soul setting out, unburdened by the fear of looking absurd. The little dog at his heels is the same dog that kept the real fools company in the cold halls. Even the cards remember. And he survives, because we need him to. A society without its fools, without anyone licensed to puncture the powerful, to say the unsayable, to look ridiculous on purpose so the rest of us don't have to, is a society in trouble, brittle and humorless and dangerous. We keep reinventing the fool because we keep needing what he offered, the laughter that disarms, the truth that arrives in disguise, the proof that even the coldest throne room had room for one warm and honest voice. Every comedian who's ever told a hard truth as a joke, every satirist who's mocked a tyrant and gotten away with it, every clever person who's played dumb to say something smart is wearing, somewhere under their clothes, a coat of motley. The bells are quieter now, but they never quite stopped ringing. Every profession has its sunset, and the court fools came gradually, The way the light goes out of a long afternoon, no single moment you could point to, just a slow dimming, until one day you looked around and the bells had stopped. And the great halls were silent of them, and a thing that had lasted 1,000 years was simply over. The decline tracked more or less, with the rise of a new way of being a court. As the 17th century gave way to the 18th, fashion at the great European courts turned toward refinement, toward elegance, toward a polished and rational sophistication that found the old fool, with his bells, his crude jokes, his licensed rudeness, increasingly embarrassing, a relic of a coarser age. The new ideal courtier was witty, yes, but smoothly so. The new entertainment was the salon, the opera, the clever conversation, the cultivated arts. A man in a party-coloured coat jingling and waggling a stick began to seem not charming, but vulgar, a leftover from grandfather's day, out of step with an age that prided itself on its taste and its reason. The rise of professional theatre played its part too. Once you could go to a playhouse and see a brilliant comic actor perform scripted, polished foolery to a paying crowd, the household fool started to look amateurish by comparison, and more to the point, the appetite for comedy that the fool had once monopolized now had somewhere else to go. The laughter migrated out of the throne room and onto the public stage, where it could be bought by anyone with the price of admission, and the great houses gradually stopped maintaining their own private supply of it. And there was a shift in sensibility, slow and incomplete, around the keeping of human curiosities. The Enlightenment, for all its own cruelties and blind spots, carried within it ideas that sat increasingly uneasily beside the practice of keeping people as living entertainment. The notion that all people possessed a fundamental dignity, that reason and rights belonged to everyone, gradually made the old casual display of human difference harder to square with the court's image of itself as enlightened and humane. The change was slow, hypocritical, and full of exceptions. The keeping and displaying of people for amusement did not vanish. It merely changed its venues and its justifications, drifting into other and sometimes worse forms in the centuries that followed. But the specific figure of the court fool, the household jester kept beside the throne, faded as the world that made sense of him faded. The naturals, the kept curiosities, were the first to go quiet in the records, and then the artificial fools, the professional jesters, until by the later 18th century the role had become a curiosity in itself, a thing courts had once done, remembered with a mix of nostalgia and faint embarrassment. A few lingered, here and there, in more old-fashioned or remote courts, the last of a long line, jingling on after the music had stopped. And then they too were gone, and the great houses that had kept fools for 1,000 years kept them no longer, and the party-coloured coat passed entirely out of real life and into memory, into theatre, into the storybook and the tarot card and the comfortable imagination, where it has lived ever since. It's a quiet ending for so long-lived a thing. No grand finale, no last great fool taking a bow. Just a slow fading, a role outliving its world, the bells growing fainter court by court, until one season nobody noticed they'd stopped. The fools who'd spent 1,000 years being the ones who saw clearly while everyone else looked away, slipped out of history almost unwatched, which is perhaps the most fool-like exit of all. To leave the great hall while the party's still going, unremarked, the little dog trotting at your heels, off the edge of the recorded world and into legend. Before we turn toward the close, let's take stock of what the fools left in the world, the traces they pressed into language and culture so deeply that we use them every day without ever thinking of the men in motley they came from. Because for a profession that's been gone for centuries, the fool's fingerprints are astonishingly everywhere, hidden in plain sight, and finding them is a soft and pleasant way to drift. The language first. We've met the coxcomb already, that rooster's comb hood that became a word for a vain and foolish person. But there are more. To play the fool, to make a fool of, the whole rich vocabulary of folly, these phrases carry the real institution inside them. When we call someone a motley fool, we are describing his coat. When we speak of someone jesting, we are naming his profession. The very word antics descends from a kind of grotesque performance the fools and their kin were known for. The fool left himself scattered through the dictionary like seeds, and they've grown so thoroughly into the common soil of speech that we've forgotten they were ever planted. The cards, as we touched on, the fool of the tarot, stepping off his cliff, and the joker of the ordinary playing deck, that odd extra card with the jester printed on it, the one that doesn't belong to any suit, the wild card that can become anything. That's the fool too, preserved in cardboard, the figure outside the normal order, belonging to no suit, able to stand for anything precisely because he stands apart from the system. Every time you shuffle a deck and find the joker grinning up at you in his bells, you're holding a 400-year-old memory of a real man whose whole power lay in being outside the ordinary rules. The stage, most of all, and the screen that descended from it. Every wise fool in every great play, every sad clown, every comic who tells the truth through laughter, every trickster who plays dumb to outwit the powerful, they all carry the court fool's inheritance. The idea that the comic relief might also be the moral centre, that the one who makes us laugh might also be the one who sees most clearly, that folly and wisdom are secretly the same thing wearing different hats. That idea is the court fool's great bequest to all the storytelling that came after him. We absorbed it so completely that it feels like common sense now, but somebody had to live it first, in real throne rooms, at real risk, before it could become a convention of fiction. And there are the quieter echoes, the ones that aren't quite traceable, but that you feel anyway. The cultural permission, never fully revoked, for the jester figure to mock the powerful. The instinct that laughter is somehow on the side of truth, against pomp and tyranny and self-importance. The deep cultural fondness for the underdog who's cleverer than his betters, the holy fool, the wise simpleton, the person we underestimate at our peril. All of it traces back, through tangled and untraceable roots, to 1,000 years of real men standing beside real thrones, jingling, joking, and telling the truth nobody else dared to tell. They left more than they knew. They thought, most of them, that they were just getting through another day at a difficult job, making a dangerous man laugh, keeping their welcome, keeping their place. They couldn't have known they were salting the whole future of human culture with their coat and their bells and their licensed wit. But they were, and every time we laugh at power, or trust the fool over the king, or shuffle a deck and find the joker, we are, without knowing it, remembering them. We're near the close now, and the night is deep, and it feels right to end where these long lives so often ended, with the quiet aftermath, the coat hung up, the bells gone still. The man underneath finally just a man. Imagine the last day of a court fool's working life. Not a famous one, not a Sommer or a Hudson, just one of the countless ordinary fools whose names didn't survive. A man grown old in the motley, his joints stiff now, his voice not as quick as it was, his patron aged or gone. The court around him changed into something that no longer quite knew what to do with him. There comes a day, in a life like that, when the coat is hung up for the last time, when the bells are set aside, when the marotte is laid down on a shelf, that little wooden face still smiling its carved smile, and not picked up again. The performing is over. The watching, the reading of the room, the daily walk along the edge of the line, all of it done, and what's left is just a tired old man in a quiet room who spent his whole life making other people laugh. What did they feel, those last fools, when the work was finally done? We can't know. But you can imagine a kind of relief in it, under the sadness, the relief of no longer having to be funny, no longer having to be sharp, no longer having to dress hard truths in bells and hope the king laughed instead of frowned. A whole life spent performing, and then, at last, permission to simply be, to sit by a fire as yourself, to be quiet, to stop. These were people who gave their lives to a strange and difficult art, the art of being the one honest voice in a dishonest room, of carrying truth past the defences of the powerful, of standing closest to the cold heart of authority and keeping it warm with laughter, all while bearing the loneliness of being the only one allowed to see clearly. They were exploited and they were cherished, displayed and protected, mocked and beloved, often all at once, by masters who held every card. Some of them rose to wealth and standing. Some of them never had a voice of their own preserved at all. All of them were people, whole, real, complicated people, who happened to be handed one of the oddest roles a human being has ever been asked to play, and who played it, most of them, with more courage and grace than the role had any right to ask. They eased the loneliness of kings. They told the truth to tyrants and lived. They sat in grief while the court danced behind them. They climbed out of pies and became captains. They were painted with dignity by the greatest hands of their age, and they were forgotten by everyone else. And they left their coat and their bells and their wits scattered through our language and our stories and our cards, where they live still, long after the last of them hung up the motley and sat down by the fire to rest. So tonight, as you drift off, spare one soft thought for the fools, the real ones, the named and the nameless, the clever and the simple, the cherished and the used. They lived in the corners of history's grandest rooms, and they're mostly gone now, gone the way nearly everyone who ever lived is gone, into the great quiet. But they were here. They jingled through the cold halls and made the powerful laugh, and saw more clearly than anyone, and for 1,000 years they were the one warm and human thing in the coldest places on earth. That's a life worth honouring. That's a life worth remembering, just for a moment, in the dark, before sleep. The coat is hung up, the bells are still, The little wooden head smiles on the shelf in the dark, keeping its own counsel at last. And the fool, after a long life of watching everyone else, finally closes his eyes. Rest well, sleep gently. Good night.